almost all of the coverage really centers on the perspectives of the same kind of subset of people in the country, predominantly rural white men who are economically anxious and feeling disenfranchised. And we feel that that perspective has been heard from enough. And often what we have noticed in our wanderings through the media landscape is that a lot of the coverage of political polarization or political identity alone, or even electoral behavior in immigrant communities, tends to really fetishize and really drop in a very anthropological way with these kinds of salacious stories about Trump voters in immigrant communities. And we know, those of us who are from immigrant communities and have written extensively from the perspective of community-based journalism, we know that the story is much more complicated than that. We know that we inhabit a very diverse political spectrum in all of our communities, and that these political spectrums are also, and these political identities are also influenced by the communities in which we live and the political discourse that happens here, and also by influence campaigns that are happening on social media from countries of origin and also here. So part of why we're having this conversation series here is really not just to shift how we define and view and understand political polarization, but to really center the expertise of the publishers from community-based media who have been navigating these turbulent waters for many decades, and who are also really on the front lines of trying to resolve and respond to these crises as they evolve. They are on the front lines of cyberbullying. They are on the front lines of social media disinformation campaigns. They are on the front lines of trying to build solidarity between members of their own communities and audiences, and also with other communities that are targeted by disinformation, by right-wing extremism, and by political polarization. So really what we want to do is center their expertise and ask them how they are not just approaching the business of journalism, but how they are creating spaces in their communities to really bring communities together, to build solidarity and connections within communities and among other communities of color that are most impacted by these crises, and to really do what the purpose of journalism really is, which is to provide a space for civic engagement and really sustain democracy in the United States. And we have today, we're so excited to have three guests who are really, really doing this work. The first of the conversations took place last week. We were very fortunate to have three publishers who are serving communities that have been historically targeted by white nationalist violence systematically, and have for many decades navigated the onslaught of white nationalism. And in the face of these rising white nationalism in US government, have managed to build power and are now serving their communities that now are in this new political climate, perhaps facing trauma responses within their staff. So we had publishers serving Jewish audiences across the country, a publisher serving Black audiences in the US South, and a publisher serving primarily like a diverse Latinx communities on the US-Mexico border, but with a large undocumented population as well in her audience. So those publishers spoke with us last week. We can also share the recording of that conversation with anyone who's interested. I'll just send it to everyone who joins into this conversation when I send the recording of this event. And today we have three publishers serving highly polarized immigrant communities that are subject to disinformation campaigns, and where simple things like rumor and misinformation have become the stuff of political divide and political division. So we want to hear from them, and we also want to hear from all of you. And next week, we're going to have a conversation with three radio broadcasters who are serving communities in rural areas where there is visible right-wing militancy and armed militant activity present in government organizations and in legislatures. And these broadcasters are serving communities where there are very limited news sources. So for that conversation, we're going to have a broadcaster serving communities within and around rural Boise, Idaho, which is home of the 3%ers, where the 3%ers have a very predominant, a strong foothold in local government. And we're also going to have a broadcaster serving the sovereign nation of the Hoopa Valley tribe in present-day Southern California. And we're going to have a broadcaster serving communities in the mountains of Colorado, which is represented by Lauren Boebert, and also has a significant significant amount of right-wing and armed militancy present there. We hope you'll join us next week. We are so excited to be a part of this conversation. These conversation series are the beginning of an ongoing initiative that we hope to carry out here at CCM about political polarization and community-based media. The next step, we hope to have a series of closed-door conversations within communities, so publishers and broadcasters, podcasters, organizations serving communities, different audiences of a same community can come together and create workshops and systems for addressing disinformation, right-wing extremism, polarization crises as they evolve in real time. We hope to create from that a peer-to-peer network. So if somebody is dealing with a sudden crisis, they can reach out to the network and troubleshoot ideas for cybersecurity, cyberbullying, legal risks, all of these things. And we hope to just create a space where we can really center your expertise in this conversation. So one of the ideas is to create some body of research that we will publish or make available online in some sort of way where you can really see and learn from the publishers here. We're so excited to have all of you all here. We hope you'll all be a part of the conversation. Please feel free to, I see many publishers here and community-based journalists here. So if you can, please drop your name and the publication and the community that you serve in the chat. What we're going to do here is have a moderated conversation for about a half hour, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A. Please feel free to share your questions in the chat, or if you want to send them directly to me, that's absolutely no problem. I want to state here that this conversation is public and it's on the record. We are going to record the conversation and make the recording available to anyone, but we'd like to ask that if you want to quote any of the panelists in a published work, if you can, please reach out to them separately for confirmation and consent before you publish anything that they say. And if you want to stay in touch, I would love to hear from any of you publishers that are working and serving polarized immigrant communities. This is going to be an ongoing project for me and for CCM, so I'd love to hear from all of you. My name is Kavita Rajagopalan. I am the Community Engagement Manager at CCM, and it's now my great pleasure to introduce you to all of the panelists. The panelists today are Irene Romulo, who is the publisher of Cicero Independiente, which is a newer platform. It launched as a digital platform in the suburbs of Chicago, a town called Cicero. And this community is very diverse, but the audience that she serves is predominantly Mexican American, Central American, and other Spanish-speaking communities from Central and North America. The community there is nearly 20% undocumented, and Cicero Independiente has done a lot of work around engaging that community to find out what they'd like to hear, what kinds of stories they want to hear, what their primary concerns are, and she's going to be sharing a lot of that with us today. Suchitra Vijayan is a human rights attorney, and we are very excited to announce that this week is the publication of her first book, Midnight's Borders, A People's History of India, of Indian Borders. So anyone who is interested in the history of immigration and borders in India and South Asia should definitely run, don't walk, and get yourself a copy today. It's an excellent work, a labor of love that she's taken many, many years to do with on-the-ground reporting. She is the publisher of the Polis Project, which launched about 4 years ago, I believe actually, as a platform to really document human rights atrocities and the erosion of democracy in India. And it has now grown to be more of a community-based platform here in the United States to inform and educate South Asian communities here in the United States about the crisis of democracy in India and its many forms, and to build solidarity with various Black and Brown communities that are addressing the erosion of democracy both here and in countries of origin and globally in diaspora. And finally, we are very excited to hear from Lizelle Tanglao, a very experienced journalist who has worked in many, many platforms and recently launched about a year ago the new platform called Tayo, which is a bilingual English and Tagalog help desk to answer questions about COVID-19 for Filipino American communities here in the United States, which have been extremely vulnerable during the COVID-19 crisis, and where there is quite a bit of misinformation around how to access health services and how to address the needs, the community's needs during this crisis. All of these publishers are, are on the front lines. They are newer publishers in communities that do have older, long-standing legacy publications. I see some publishers here who have been serving these communities for many years. The reason we chose to focus on these publishers and to center their voices in this conversation is that they are working now to really figure out really new innovative strategies to establish trust, to deftly grow audiences in communities where there are very inflamed political divisions, and to expand audiences in communities that are under attack from disinformation, from cyberbullying. And we wanted to position them as women publishers at a time where cyberbullying crisis is really affecting, it's really segued with misogyny and right-wing violence towards women. So we want to hear from all of them. Against that backdrop, I'd like to first ask Lizelle to share a little bit about her publication. Right now, we are dealing with not just a crisis of democracy here in the United States, but also rising anti-Asian violence. And Lizelle is serving a community that has been very impacted by this. So I'd like to first ask her to tell us a little bit about how Teo came to be and how she understands political polarization from her vantage point as a publisher serving the Filipino American community here in the US, and what she hopes to do, what is the priority agenda item in addressing political violence and political divisions and polarization in her community right now. Lizelle.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, so Tayo really, the origin story really came about within our community. It's just trying to answer a very simple question, really how to navigate a lot of these very difficult conversations we've been seeing within our community, especially with when the pandemic hit the US in the spring of last year. So, as the sponsoring organization that started Tayo is the Filipino Young Leaders Program. So we were all a group of young professionals. And, last year we were all struggling with trying to figure out, how do we talk to our older relatives, our lolas, our titos or titas that were, falling victim to misinformation that was being shared among their own peer group. And, they just weren't staying home and they weren't following the protocol. And we were all trying to struggle. How do we reach that group that, is very significant to us personally, as well as a community. So we started trying to think about it. And the idea came about of building a playbook, which eventually evolved into the Tayo Help Desk, something that could respond to frequently asked questions that we were already hearing in the community, as well as trying to put that factual, reliable information out there so that if, our community was sharing information, they were sharing information that was vetted. And not only that, but also culturally tailored. It wasn't enough for us to just, simply send a link to a CDC a fact sheet. That's just not how our community responds to that. So we wanted to make sure we were really, tailoring and culturally tailoring and writing this content to our audience, which, not all the time is being catered to. In terms of the political polarization, I think this was also part of the origin story of this. One of the main things we were trying to answer is how do we talk to my uncle, for example, who watches certain news organizations that, maybe were not necessarily putting out factual information about COVID. So, that just, again, spurred on the effort on our end to try to, present this information in a way that it was factual and reliable, and that would resonate so that people would make the most informed decision. Especially now that, the vaccine rollout has been taking place. How do you navigate through that? And, it's been, to be honest, it's still been a challenge because it's a good reminder for us, at least for the Filipino community, we're not a monolith. There's different varying views within the community, and there's not a one size fit all in terms of responding to that. So it's a constant kind of learning curve for all of us involved, and also trying to really, really, truly listen to the community and try to figure out what, how do we get at the heart of what is really important here and tailor that messaging.
Thank you so much, Lizelle. So you've drawn on a really important point here that sometimes what we need to do to really earn audience trust and to establish the groundwork for wider coverage beyond a specific issue is to focus on a specific issue that might be an organizing concern now. So now I want to turn to Irene and ask a little bit about what you thought was going to be the organizing concern for your community and how you came about creating the profile and the publishing platform of the news agenda for Cicero Independiente. Can you speak a little bit to political polarization in your community and how you as a publisher are approaching this?
Yeah, thank you. So hi, everybody. So we launched Cicero, three of us launched Cicero Independiente in late 2019. A big part of why we wanted to launch specifically like local news organization here in Cicero is because Cicero is just outside of the city of Chicago, and over 80% of the population here is Latinx and speaks a language other than English at home. And growing up here, we really saw the disservice and how the lack of having a local paper that's bringing and pushing for more local transparency and really like highlighting stories from our community, how much of the service that does to people who are trying to become rooted in a place and also like engage in local democracy. So in 2019, one of the, because of that too, like in 2019, we were having conversations about the ways how objectivity is weaponized against people of color, and how, again, like a lot of, at least our initial conversations, we spoke about how unhappy we were with how immigrant communities are portrayed in the media, or how often a lot of the immigrant coverage isn't necessarily for immigrant communities, but just about us, and with a very narrow view of who we are, often like centering our trauma. So to Kavitha's point, like when we first started, we decided to do a number of interviews in our community to figure out, well, what do people actually think about the media, and what are some of their information needs. And coming from an organizing background and from a community where a large part of our neighbors are undocumented, I had incorrectly assumed that immigration would be the focus of our coverage, the focus of what people would want to know. Where is the latest immigration rate? What can we do in case there is an immigration rate? But from those conversations that we had, we learned how, at least, when we wanted to start something and hearing from people, we need to make sure that our news coverage and like what we're doing is actually amplifying the whole spectrum of who we are and our full identities. And that includes, like, yes, wanting to learn about immigration, but also wanting to learn what's happening in our local school boards, what's happening in schools, what are some of the mental health resources that are available, or what are some of the stories of accomplishment and like resilience that are happening in our community. And with that too, like I think a lot of times what's missing in conversations, and some of what we've tried to do most recently, even with what happened, with the uprisings after the killing of George Floyd last year, like talking about the very real ways that we as a community are hurt and impacted by white supremacy, but how we ourselves can become agents of white supremacy, and how at least us as publishers, we can listen to these conversations, we can, or at least listen to like what people are saying, report like on or what is happening, but also use the access to information and different things that we have as publishers to ensure that we're bringing people together to have these conversations, and highlighting a lot of the often like yet unheard voices within our communities, right? So centering some of the organizing that's happening. And at least in Cicero, Cicero has a very long history of anti-Black violence stemming from even before we were a majority Latinx community. And some of that, it hasn't gone away. And it was something that became very apparent last year, and I can talk further about it later on. But as publishers who are, we started because we were angry that our voices weren't being centered, but also how do we center the voices of Black people in our community while they're still like a very small, at least in numbers, part of our community. So yeah, I'll leave that at there.
Thank you so much, Irene. Now, Suchitra, I want to turn to you. Now, we know that political divisions have always existed in India, and right-wing nationalism has been on the rise in India for many, many decades. So I want to ask you, can you share a little bit about how you decided to launch Polis, what you have seen change in your time there? And Irene and Lizelle have spoken kind of very eloquently about this idea of, the role of a publisher in kind of speaking truth, not only to power outside of the community, but speaking truth to the community. What is your experience in dealing with this with the Indian community, where there can be some resistance to these types of call outs or all of this? And how are you positioning your role as a publisher in sort of educating and growing audience at this time?
Kavita, thank you so much for putting this together. Again, thank you for Lizelle and Irene for eloquent articulations of how we think, not only speak truth to power, but also truth to our communities. Polis Project started from a place of realizing that for communities in resistance, there really wasn't a place to talk about what that means. When I say communities in resistance, India has a long list of communities in resistance. If one was to write about the history of India or larger South Asia, one could talk about the communities that have been in the receiving end of state violence, despite a secular democratic constitution, who continue to fight for rights. And one of the ways that we wanted to think about Polis Project was a space for us to not only think about, question and speak truth to power, but also ways for us to center what was happening. And long before disinformation, one thing that we found was that the long historical nature of erasure, right? So this is not only about communities that no longer are not only fighting against state rule, these are also communities that have a long history of being silenced. And with that, you saw starting about 2012, 2013, you saw a rise of a certain kind of authoritarian right-wing politics emerge globally. This was true of Turkey, this was true of India, with Narendra Modi coming to power in 2014. And I think with Trump coming to power in 2016, it was a moment for us to say that this trend of right-wing authoritarian movement is going to spread. It was not only authoritarian regimes, but even democracies could become illiberal. And how do we think about these authoritarian regimes? And for us, it was very important to connect what was happening in these communities to a global resistance movement, but also think about these communities as communities in resistance. Who gets to talk about this resistance? Who gets to talk about dissent? So we see ourselves as a platform that is created to accommodate those voices. We produce knowledge for and by communities in resistance. And by communities in resistance, we not only talk about the farmers protesting, we also say that there's a link between the farmers protest, the CA NRC protest, and it's linked to what's happening, say, in Ferguson, or the death of George Floyd. And what does it mean for the brown immigrant community in the United States to think through these ideas? Another thing that we found was that predominantly, at least within the diasporic communities, that again, we are very diverse. Often the voices that get amplified tend to be upper caste, upper class, communities that tend to be, often we hide behind the question of the model minority myth. So now the question is, there's almost a very direct erasure of working brown communities, because again, we are hiding behind the value of model minority. And often these very communities that might support democratic values and secular liberal values in the United States then go back and support right-wing authoritarian values back home. So how do we reconcile those things? How do we educate? How do we understand? And how do we make sure that communities have a space to think and talk, and also centering the question of state violence and human rights violations and making that something that's easily accessible. I think those were the kind of values that we've been continuing to think about and kind of push for as we produce work that is at the intersection of research and reportage.
Thank you so much, Suchitra. So you've mentioned here this very powerful concept of the model minority and, meritocracy, and how that can ultimately be not just a shield that we hide behind, but something that can be damaging, not only to our own communities, but to building with other communities. So I want to ask Irene to describe, you've spoken with me before about some of your effort, since you're telling community stories, to reframe the immigrant success story in a way that truly builds power within the community. Can you share some of your experiences in that way?
Yeah, and that was initially one of the things that when we did these informational interviews before we launched, that was shared to us, people wanting to know like what is happening in Cicero, like who is like what are these success stories, because they spoke about how often when, news talks or comes about Cicero, it's just when something tragic happens and like never comes back, but like understanding there's a lot of great things happening here. And as part of that, at least for us, it's been important to highlight stories of people who, they're not just succeeding because they, for example, the like model minority story of the student who, worked super hard and got into Harvard, right? Out of like all the thousands of students. Those are like great like successes that happen in our community, and yes, they should be celebrated, but they're not the only ones, and they also like serve they serve as a weapon, as a tool to like, say what determine for us what is success and what is successful, instead of really looking at all of the other ways that people, come to create their own success. And that's part of like what we've tried to do too. For example, we at the beginning of our coverage, we highlighted a couple that launched a business here in Cicero, a drink business. And part of why at least that story was so appealing was the reason why they wanted to do that, and what they saw as success wasn't necessarily getting to a point where they're like a multi-million-dollar company, but rather to have enough to take care of their parents, to take care of their elderly parents. And that was something that, we thought was so important to highlight the different way that they're measuring their own success and how it resonates with a largely like also immigrant community here, and with like children of immigrants. So like that is something that's always in the back of our head, and like thinking about the why, right? Like also we've talked about also doing stories of different ways that, that is something that can sometimes be disempowering as well, because our parents should be able to have the things that they need, and not necessarily be, dependent on whatever support we can provide in a way. But that's a whole different story and conversation. But those are the kinds of stories that we like seek and want to highlight too, the different ways that we're measuring our own success outside of, the confines of like predominantly white institutions that, these colleges or different like forms of employment can be.
Thank you, Irene. So, Lizelle, you have spoken about the imperative for launching Tayo was really this imperative that is defined by your role as a child of immigrants, and trying to really create a space to provide service for the elders in the community. But one thing I wanted to also refer back to is that you've mentioned that there was a certain point that you noticed as a publisher that these kinds of general skepticism towards public health resources, or just rumors, superstition, the way that plays out towards health in our communities. This idea that was going around in WhatsApp in March that you could combat COVID by gargling salt water every day, these kinds of things. At a certain point, you saw those kind of transmute into disinformation campaigns and suspected that there was right-wing involvement in that. Can you share a little bit about how you address those disinformation campaigns without inflaming divisions, or just the generational challenges that you faced in your role as a publisher?
Yeah, I mean, the trends that we were seeing once we saw, like, for example, that meme that was like just going viral everywhere, really, it was just, anecdotally, like, a couple of our core team members saw this within their own families. And these folks were, highly engaged in watching, news organizations like Fox News that kept repeating a lot of this stuff, like not necessarily that, but just a lot of things that weren't true. So we knew that we had to figure out a way that, like, if they were constantly being shown this, like, what could we do to combat that? And so I think, it just basically putting together a list of these, questions and answers that just directly debunked some of those myths was one of the ways that we started to do it. And also, we also tried to create a space where it was okay to ask some of these questions, because a lot of the cultural barriers existed within our community, just even before COVID, things like, like cultural barriers, like, that when you mix like, religion, for example, like the Bahalana, leaving things up to God, which also kind of, impacted some of our folks in terms of seeking care. There's this, notion of hiya, or shame. Like a lot of folks in our community are afraid to ask for help because they're ashamed to ask for help. They don't want people to know that they're sick. So we were trying to like really respond to that by, creating a space that was okay to ask these questions. And we quickly realized, and we had to kind of pivot when we launched in October, that we weren't getting too many questions, like where you could submit a question and you have your name and your identifying information. So what we did was like we added another form where people can ask anonymously, and we got more questions that way. And I think that just goes back to kind of just this, notion of mistrust with, possibly government officials. And you can probably trace that back to the motherland for folks that have immigrated here. And just even in the current political climate. So we tried to make it as simple and accessible as possible so that people were still getting the information they needed, but they still felt okay asking, because it's not always easy to ask for help, especially if you come from a community that has, it's in the DNA to kind of just like, do what you need to do. But, we were trying to kind of, it's almost kind of that modeling kind of the change behavior you want to see, and hopefully get people to know that, it's fine. So it's still an ongoing issue. And we're trying to be more proactive about it in terms of addressing some of these things. So, which is one of the reasons why we are looking to launch a nationwide survey around Filipinos' attitudes around vaccinations, hopefully in the next couple of weeks, so that we could better understand what are the concerns and what are the questions out there that no one's talking about, so that we could respond to that as the rollouts of these vaccines continue to go much wider.
Thank you so much, Lizelle. Yeah, this vaccine attitude survey is going to be really, really important. I think a lot of communities are dealing with this, this lack of insight into where attitudes and perspectives really translate into difficulty in accessing resources and care around this crisis. So Lizelle has mentioned, you spoke to this idea of, attitudes from the home country or the influence from countries of origin. So I want to turn to Suchitra here. We know that the Modi regime in India has an actual social media department that really is creating disinformation campaigns and what can really be referred to as state level propaganda. I want to ask you, how is this influencing political discourse in diasporic communities here? And Lizelle has also spoken to this idea of shame and how sometimes speaking of the reality of political reality can trigger a shame response in diasporic communities that may have low information about what's actually happening in the country of origin. How have you dealt with this challenge in your role as a publisher and also as a woman publisher?
I think the greatest challenge that we face is what I found surprisingly or unsurprisingly, depending on where you are where you are addressing this, is that communities that had the most misinformation or disinformation were actually communities that saw themselves as the model minority. Often, even those, there's this very interesting term that's been coined called the Modi Democrats, or communities who are democratic in the United States but support the right-wing authoritarian regime of Modi back home. And surprisingly, many of these people who hold these beliefs, it's not low information, but what you really see is misinformation, but also refusal to acknowledge facts, even when you place it in front of them. One of the interesting conversations that I've had is one of the conversations that keeps coming over and over again is how minority community, there's an appeasement of minority communities in India. And a lot of the hate gets directed towards the Muslim communities and, of course, Dalit and other Bahujan communities. I want to kind of put forth two different examples. One is the myth of how the Muslim population in India is exploding, and then soon, there would be a majority. But in reality, often this is seen as, this is used as a way to, of course, this is a blatantly Islamophobic, argument. But even when we would put information that kind of debunks this, it is your economists, it is your IIT educated engineers, it is your people who went to Ivy League schools. Even when you place information or facts in front of them, what was really surprising is facts really did not change their mind. At this point in time, what you really saw was a deep ideological commitment to the idea of a Hindu Rashtra. And even those who call themselves liberal or secular have all flirted with the idea of Hindutva. On the other hand, it is the minority communities, the Muslims, Dalit communities in the diaspora, often communities that are working communities that actually have far more political clarity because they also come from a history of persecution back home. So when they migrate, they also migrate with histories of resistance, of dealing with it. A lot of the folks that we work with now also have memories of living through riots and pogroms in India as a minority. So in that sense, it is not so much about misinformation, disinformation, low information, but it's simply sometimes even putting facts and information and reported pieces in front of people, and people still refuse to understand. Second, of course, is the question of using development as a way to say that, oh, no, I understand that we have these human rights violations. I understand that people are being cleared, but I think we really need to focus on development, as if building more roads, building more infrastructure somehow automatically is a reason to disregard basic constitutional principles and norms. And the third thing that we then realized is that despite having so much an information revolution that exploded in India post 90s, most communities don't know what's happening. For example, when we do talks on Kashmir, or when we do conversations around Kashmir, the average Indian doesn't know what's happening. The average Indian doesn't know that it's one of the most militarized zones. The average Indian doesn't know what pellet guns are. They do not know what the PSA laws are used to arrest young boys. So one is, again, of course, refusal to accept facts, but the second is also that even the basic ideas, when we talk about communities that have witnessed pogroms or have been on the receiving end of state violence, often the first response is that larger communities, especially privileged communities, have very little information about that. So this has been our experience of doing it. And the success has been that we consistently have conversations, we put information out, but also engaging with the younger communities, those born in the diaspora who are now in their who are in their teenage years, who are in their 20s, 30s, kind of trying to educate them in a way that doesn't make them feel that the idea of education is that education is pedagogy and pedagogy is political. The idea that you can to give convince someone to give 5 minutes of their time to read something that you published is a political act. And engage them in a way so that they then read what you say and then think through it as a political act. And I think that is something that we've been really focusing on in terms of just getting these information out. How successful or not successful, I think we're still working through that, figure out if just putting this out is actually being successful.
Thank you so much, Suchitra. I want to ask one last question and then turn it to the floor. But first, I want to just ask Irene to share a little bit more. Suchitra was mentioning about this sort of default positions and the way that influence works in our communities. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to not just what happened in Cicero over the summer during the uprisings and some of the anti-Black violence that you all bore witness to there, but some of the responses that you saw from highly influential and high status members of the community, and then how you as a publisher are working to kind of combat those statements and actions from highly influential people to really build information and solidarity inside through Cicero Independiente as a publisher.
Yeah. And one of the things that Suchitra just said too is about engaging and reading all of this as a political act. And I'm like, yes, like, and that's some of what like we are trying to foster as well. Like in the summer last year, you know, after all of the uprisings were happening around us, you know, people were organizing in Cicero to, you know, in response to what was happening, being in solidarity with the Black community. But we also saw a huge wave, at least on June 1st. That'll be a day that will be forever embedded in my mind. In different neighborhoods in Chicago and in Cicero, there were people out, at least members of the Latinx community, that under the guise of like protecting property were participating in anti-Black violence. And these are, you know, things that we witnessed, we saw. I am here in Cicero. I went out that day. I was documenting. I was, you know, part of interfering in some like very like hard instances of like physical violence and trying to stop, you know, like people from hurting somebody else. So it was a weird time to like be out there, trying to be out there as a journalist and also as a person who's like witnessing all of this violence happening. But as part of that, at least some of what we were trying to do immediately after that happened, there was a large part of our community that, you know, came out in support of Black residents here, and for a whole week and even afterwards have been organizing different conversations, different solidarity events, different solidarity marches. But from at least some of what we saw from like public figures, at least in the area, we saw a lot of denying of like what was happening, and a lot of shaming of the people who spoke up against and in solidarity with, spoke up against what was happening and spoke up in solidarity with the Black community. So we saw a lot of that shaming and trying to, you know, pretend like what happened on June 1st didn't happen. As part of like at least the response that we wanted to have was like, we didn't publish anything about it right away. We knew that it was uh, it would have been a reactionary moment for us to like publish something, you know, that wasn't complete, at least, and didn't try to actually listen to like a lot more perspectives besides like what we saw out there. So we actually put out a call for people to send us their contributions, their videos, their photographs, their personal testimonies. And we also partnered with different community members here to do like some of that initial reporting. And we saw that, and like that now is a political act, like what Sutrika is talking about, like sharing their personal stories of like what they witnessed, what they went through, you know, sharing like their personal stories of those moments of fears of people like not wanting to even leave their homes, or like we heard of some people who hid in the trunks of cars because they were scared to like come into Cicero. So it was, you know, we took a number of weeks to actually like conduct a lot of interviews, like put together a timeline of what happened based on, you know, we filed Freedom of Information Act requests from the police department, from the town. We took people's images, videos to create a timeline of everything that happened for a week. We documented personal narratives. We put out a story to how to talk about anti-Blackness with like older generations, or like with people who like, you know, don't see that as a part of our community, as a part of who we are. But, you know, it was, we thought that was at least a very important series for us to put out there, both to like document what happened, and document the resistance that came from it, at least in all of the solidarity work, and begin to have and create a space for those much needed conversations and like things to happen. And at least since then, we know that some of that is being used by educators who are currently trying to change the way that the public school system here talks about what happened, and like creates a more culturally like responsive curriculum that addresses like racial injustice. We know that like some of that curriculum has helped to host conversations by different community organizations here who want to address anti-Blackness in the Latinx community. And at least part of what I shared earlier before is about us as journalists utilizing the tools that we have at our disposal to create more like solidarity, you know, through like different archival research that we were able to do, and different like newspaper archives that we have access to. We've actually been able to find and connect some organizers here with living relatives of people who were harmed in the 60s and in the 70s here in Cicero, to create some of that dialogue and allow for some of that historical analysis and perspective to be brought to the organizing that's happening in our town today. So yeah, I'm really glad that you like brought that framing up, Suchitra, because it's so important. Like, our journalism is not apolitical, right? Like, we are not, we don't exist in a vacuum. So we have definitely a perspective, and we have a lot of power. All journalists, all publishers have a lot of power in choosing what stories and who they want to center, and like what movements they want to center. So that's something that we keep always at the forefront of our work, and in deciding even what stories we publish.
Thank you so much, Irene. I have a question from a New York City-based publisher. This is Mr. Indrajit Saluja. I'm going to, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself.
Good afternoon, everybody, and particularly the host today. And my question stems from what Suchitra has been saying. This is a question, Ms. Rajgopalan, about what the social media and the government-sponsored propaganda is doing to us. As she rightly pointed out, and we have seen here earlier in America how the lies of a particular person led to an attack on the temple of democracy in Washington. And that also was carried out on social media. The same thing has been systematically being carried out by government of India, the Modi regime, ever since he came to power in 2014. And rightly has she pointed out that they have a division, this IT cell, which has more than 20,000 people working, and each is assigned to tweet a couple of times a day or post the misinformation a couple of times a day. And it has become such an enormous challenge to us in the media that we don't know what to do, because as a publisher of the Indian Panorama here, what I find is I'm isolated when I try to be. I mean, I'm apolitical. Rene, sorry for saying that. You said that journalists are not apolitical. They also have perspective. Yes, I have perspective, but I'm apolitical. I have an objective view. Now, when I talk to them, now, no, this is misinformation. And if I post something on a social media platform, immediately I'm inundated by 20, 30, 40, uh, responses condemning me, I mean, calling me anti-national, Pakistani, and now they have added, because they have now something conflict going on with China, so China has also been roped it. So not only anti-nationalist Pakistani, but also Chinese. And on top of it, because I have a turban, I'm a Khalistan. And see what is happening in India. In the people are being arrested for sedition, young people who have nothing to do with Khalistan or anything, but just because they want to derail a movement, people's movement, farmers' movement, they are bringing in this kind of a thing. We have to fight it out together. Not only the Indian journalists, Indian origin journalists here, but also all journalists across the world have to come on one platform and fight against this campaign of misinformation being engineered and launched and vigorously pushed forward by the regimes themselves. That is what I wanted to say, and that may be construed as a question, that what we can do going forward. That is my question. What we as journalists can do going forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Indrajit. I'm going to ask Suchitra if you can speak to this, but then I want to open this up to all of the panelists. What Indrajit has spoken to here is the cyberbullying issue. And I want to ask you if all of you can speak. As women now, we know as women publishers, you are uniquely targeted by cyberbullying that is also paired with misogyny. So I'm wondering if you, first Suchitra, and then all of you can respond a little bit to what this influence plays on your role as a publisher trying to serve a community where there is not only cyber violence directed towards you, but also just kind of a mistrust of women in leadership roles, and how you can combat disinformation and establish trust in your communities from this position.
Thanks, Kavita. I think there are two things. Even before even before we go to the right-wing trolls or people who issue death and rape threats to women in public spaces, I want to say that even in liberal, so-called left-wing spaces, the kind of misogyny and disrespect that women face is, especially if you are if you are not someone who's seen as coming from certain caste, class, backgrounds. Even, I mean, there are moments in which I've been in rooms with, people who you would consider your own fellow publishers, writers, activists, scholars, and I mean, the sense that I've been interrupted. They've questioned the question of why does one, how do I get to speak? So I think we have to acknowledge that it's not a right wing, it's not the other side as if, like, I think we really have to acknowledge that it's not a question of us versus them. There is an entire spectrum of disrespect, misogyny, racism, casteism, that kind of, also colorism that plays into how a certain person is perceived in public spaces. And I really want to kind of put that in. Second, death and rape threats have become so normalized. I was just talking about this to someone else earlier today. My last rape threat was on Tuesday of last week, right? And that happens every week now. People would say things. I mean, I've been accused of taking money from anything from George Soros to, again, the point is you go back to these very anti-Semitic, Islamophobic things. People say things like, you are funded by this person, you're funded. Again, what I'm really seeing is it's a targeting not only your capacity to think, it's also targeting your capacity to do good work. It's targeting your capacity, your qualifications, and your why should you do it. It doesn't matter how many great degrees one has, how much work you've done, your body of work doesn't matter. So I think that's the second part of it. And what do we do? I think we really need to radically reimagine the ways in which we do journalism. We produce knowledge. I no longer even call it journalism. For us, it's about producing knowledge for our communities that can fight the fight better. That's why I think the work that something like Prison does, and a lot of these Black journalists that do work in terms of movement journalism, I think is a great way for all of us to learn from, push back, understand. Again, I also understand that this cannot be a cut, copy, paste model. Of course, Black diasporic communities are very different than African American communities. While we learn from them, we also have to adapt these values and qualities to our own communities. But what we have right now is not working, and we really need to do things better. We need to, I say this in a metaphorical way, not the real way. I think sometimes we really maybe just burn things down and think anew. When I say burn, I'm not physically talking the act of burning, but the act of saying that maybe this doesn't work, and maybe we don't have to fix what is broken. Maybe we just destroy what is broken and then we build something new. It's not going to be perfect. We're going to make a lot of mistakes along the way, but it's okay to do that. And I think those are the three ways in which I would perhaps think about what the next moment of this journalism or knowledge or whatever we are producing, and how we take it to the larger audience.
Thanks, Suchitra. I want to actually move to Lizelle real quickly. So one of the things you've mentioned here is, and part of the reason we're having this conversation is that we believe at CCM that rather than trying to reform mainstream journalism, which is really grappling now finally in the wake of this summer's uprisings, is grappling with its active role in upholding divisions between communities of color and active racism towards Black Americans. But one of the things that we really want to do is to really center community media as the answer to all of this. And community community-based media. So I want to ask Lizelle if you can speak a little bit to the other publishers here have spoken a lot about this question of solidarity. And I'm wondering now, with this violence that is taking place, being targeted against Asian American communities, as specifically people who are seen as East Asian looking or similar to Chinese American looking, which are all kind of roots back to racial profiling that's been targeted towards Black Americans, South Asian Americans, and Latinx Americans who may be perceived to look Mexican. This is also something that affects the Asian American communities as well. So I'm wondering, do you see a relationship between, online violence and online hateful discourse and the violence that you're seeing in your communities? And what role can you as a publisher play in drawing not only attention to what's happening, but building and welcoming more solidarity with other communities that have also faced similar violence?
Yeah, I think it all goes back to just really like, the root of like journalism is not only just the facts, but the story behind it. I think it's not enough that, sometimes it can be very easy that we can get very siloed within our own communities, but until, you start to see somebody that looks like you, that's in the middle of like what's happening now, it doesn't hit home. It's very similar to what we're seeing with just even COVID, right? It's like, I could just speak for my own personal experience. Like it wasn't for some like distant family members, they just weren't taking it seriously until they saw one of their friends, impacted by it. And I think it's similar to with what's happening with the anti-Asian violence that we're seeing now. In terms of like just solidarity, I think, there's more recent kind of attention now, at least within the Pan-Asian community, about just like, trying to like band together in what's happening to our community. I think overall, I think there's not enough questioning being circulated around. It's not only that, yes, obviously we all have very different nuances around what's happening, but why isn't there much more, conversation around like just stopping violence against people just in general? I think, and making it I get it. It's both valid on both ends, but also ultimately it's like, just as a human being, like this is happening to another community, like, where can other people step in and help? And I think it's for us, I think, and just at least for me personally, it's really gratifying to see where people are trying to lend that hand. And I think, again, it goes back to this human need to just being seen and heard. And even just by nature of doing that goes a long way.
Thank you so much, Lizelle. Did anybody else have any questions from the attendees, the participants? Okay, I wanted to actually just ask, this is a question that has come up in many of my conversations with publishers across the board serving immigrant communities, but how do we ethically fundraise in our communities? So we know that a lot of the highly influential people in our communities and our spaces may have ties with, with disinformation campaigns or with extremist movements. So I wonder if we can speak a little bit to that. I know, Lizelle, you had mentioned that previously you have been called an agent of the Duterte regime because Tayo has received funding from programs funded by the Filipino embassy. So Chitra, you have published an extensive amount of research on following money trails from U.S. campaigns of U.S. political candidates of Indian descent back to right-wing Hindu nationalist movements. And if there's any thing that you'd like to add, Irene, do any of you want to speak to that? I'll open it to any of you.
I'm happy to speak about the relationship between power and money and funding. I think one thing that we've realized over and over again in terms of the work we do is the way that we built Polis project is that we would not be dependent on the existing neoliberal landscape to fund the same things. We didn't want to be answerable to anyone except the communities that we serve so that we could do honest, decent work that again centers voices from the community. which means that we use an ethical bank. We don't take money from corporate donors. We only focus on individual donations. When we look at institutional grants, we make sure that these institutions are not funded by individuals who've made money brutalizing Black and brown bodies, which means that that rules out 96 to 97% of people who fund this kind of work, which means that even setting up those restrictions made it incredibly difficult for us. But then since we already started with this handicap, that's how we built the organization. Now, in terms of reaching out to high net worth individuals or other foundations to work, some of the challenges that we face is that India is the world's largest market. I don't know if it's still the world's largest democracy, but it's definitely the world's largest market, which means that many, many folks, even funders in the United States or Europe or European Union, all have a vested interest in wanting to do work with the Indian government. Or I'm not just talking about the Indian government, but also any of the South Asian states that we really do our work around. And many of them informally have told us that you are a too sharp a knife, in which basically means that nobody wants to rock the boat. And funding, again, kind of is implicated with the idea of power and politics. So, how does one think about fundraising within ethical means? And who are we accountable to? Within the United States, a lot of very successful, I am not generalizing, but a lot of very successful South Asians, especially Indians, tend to have economic relationships that are based on relationships with the right-wing government. A lot of them, while will not openly talk about these politics, are sympathetic to the right-wing government back home. And a lot of these people then also occupy powerful positions as funders, as donors, as in the boards of various foundations, which again complicates the relationship between power and money. And increasingly, what we've done is to move away from that model and go back to building our funding based on individual donors, building it based on the people who like our work. Of course, it's incredibly difficult because you need resources to build something. To build capacity, you need resources. And without resources, you cannot produce more work. Without producing more work, you cannot show a body of work that can then be used to build and raise more money. So in those things, I think it's really, again, important for us to completely rethink what it means to fund and raise money. Who do you take money from? For example, as I said, we use an ethical bank. Ethical banks don't invest in the prison industrial complex. Ethical banks don't invest in war. For example, one of the things that we hold dear to us is that we do not take corporate funding, or we do not take money from anybody who's made money in the war in Iraq or Afghanistan. If you are making money out of brutalizing Black and brown bodies, we don't take your money. If you have a predominant of your, if you have a large section of your money invested in fossil fuels that then goes on to fund deeply problematic environmental positions and laws, we don't take money. And I think saying no to money is also very powerful, because not many people actually say no to money. And I think that also sets you apart. But that doesn't mean that you don't have the real challenges of raising money, because at the end of the day, as an organization, as publishers, we all have responsibilities to our writers, our journalists, and people who write for us. So that's how we're thinking through how fundraising works and how we can think through ethical ways of fundraising so that we continue to do the work we do. And more importantly, we are accountable to the people who read our work, not to investment capitalists, not to funders, not to donors, not to venture capitalists.
And how are the rest of you approaching fundraising in your communities? Because as Suchitra has pointed out, taking a sort of creating an ethical framework can also limit you. But if you want to grow and reach your audiences, you need to also, have a sustainable source of funding. So how are the rest of you approaching this, given this climate of political polarization and political influence?
For us, we actually launched without any funding, and we were primarily volunteer led up until last year, a few months ago, when we were able to apply for and receive some foundation grants. But that's a conversation that I think we also need to have, both in our newsrooms, but outside of it, especially now when there's so much. I guess, interest in local news, local independent news, and what it means to like accept that money, and what it means to also like fund us in a way where, you know, it's not just, you know, rapid response grants that are going to be for like 3 or 4 or months, but like, you know, for our actual sustainability, and what it means to actually, you know, we as Cicero Independiente, at least, we're very clear about who our audience is and who our work is for. And I think part of that is also figuring out how we can make sure that the people that we want to reach with our content is also invested in funding it and seeing it as a necessity that it is, and being a part of like creating it, and also making sure that they are like funding it in a way. And that's something that we're figuring out now, how we can, you know, make sure that people are invested in it. Just how different organizing groups have like done this, other like nonprofit organizations have figured out how to develop a strong like membership base. Like it's something that we want to figure out as well.
Thank you all so much. We are over time. There's always so much to say. There's always so much to discuss, and we weren't able to get to a lot of things. But I want to just invite all of you to stay in touch with me personally and with CCM. And I will be sharing I will be sharing the recording of this event to everyone who is registered. Please feel free to share it widely.